Now, what's interesting when we talk about, we just finished talking about blame the victim mentality, and there's one other thing I wanted to mention to you in this, because we've had a number of instances, even with the closing of the college football season in Penn State, where a new coach had to be installed, essentially because the other coaches looked with a blind eye at the abuse that Jerry Sandusky was involved in. And what happened in the media oftentimes was looking at the victims as to, for some reason, for why it actually happened. What's interesting as well is the victims themselves, when they have gone through stuff, trauma and abuse, what they go through is very similar, and oftentimes they're looking for reasons why they've gone through it, and so they engage in blame the victim as well when they are the victims themselves. So they will either act with self-blame, which is one way to keep the loop fairly closed. If I point my blame gun at somebody, for example, and I point it at somebody that is more powerful than me, then I usually will lose. And so it's far easier to point the blame at myself and punish me for having done something wrong, rather than keeping the blame firmly anchored in the person who actually did it. The other reaction is anger, and acting out as a means of dissipating a lot of the emotion and so forth that also happens. The other part, which goes along with our little diagram or cartoon down here, is the world is just depending on where you are. The one that always is eaten is saying there's no justice in the world. The one who eats it is there's some, and the one who eats everyone is the world is just. And it points out a tendency in us to close the loop of rationale, of cause and effect, if you will, that are part of the backdrop to this thing, this just world phenomenon. The other thing to keep in mind is something that is referred to as the in-group or the out-group, or out-group. And generally what you find is that people stay within the group that they're in. And so mentally drawing a circle that defines us also excludes them. So we've got a us versus them mentality. I think a lot of young people very much feel that way when politics comes into play, and what they refer to as bickering between the different stripes of politicians and so forth. And so the reality is that we don't distinguish between worthy debate and just bickering, just being oppositional, just to be oppositional. But such group identifications like this promote an in-group bias, that is, favoring of one's own group over others, and that creates this us versus them kind of categorization. Now, let's talk a little bit about the cognitive roots of prejudice, because what flows out of prejudice, or how we actually arrive at something like this, you think, well, if why would we do this? This is such a negative thing to do. And the reality is that we basically simplify the world through one major method, and that's called categories. I'm going to put and categories make the world a little bit easier to remember, but also to order. And so in categorizing others, we often stereotype, which oftentimes leads to stereotypes. we stereotype the people that are within the group, and we tend to basically overestimate the similarities within the group. All right, it's not real tough to define the differences between groups, but oftentimes what we do is we think that a group is far more uniform than they usually are. The interesting thing about it is that we have a tendency to identify or recall faces of one's own race over one's own race over other races, and that happens as early as infancy, maybe even between 3 and 9 months of age. One of the fascinating things are two different heuristics, which we talked about a while ago in terms of decision making. One is called the availability heuristic. In other words, vivid cases of particular group behavior tends to come to mind more readily than other instances of behavior in each group. So the availability heuristic is certainly one that comes to mind in terms of vivid cases that prove our point about how people in a certain ethnic group tend to work. The second one, which is also quite interesting in terms of heuristics and cognitive roots of prejudice, is the hindsight bias. And like I've said before in other videos, is that our hindsight, all the pundits and commentators on the TV are make their living on hindsight bias. In other words, they make their living trying to explain what's already happened. And we do that with prejudice as well, is that we see certain things happen, and it may contribute to blaming the victim, this up here, or it also may provide a basis for a uniform basis or a uniform attitude. Let me get my M right. Attitude toward other races. That again, it blurs the differences within the group rather than emphasizing how different people are. Interestingly, we see that since 9/11, a lot of people tend to look at Arab Muslims all in the same way. They tend to see them all as terrorists, which couldn't be farther from the truth. But yet that is very much similar to the hindsight bias that occurs after 9/11, and we end up throwing people all into the same category to try to make some sense of the world.